Hey guys, tonight we're heading into something a little darker. A place where poverty, superstition and the smell of fresh rot collide. Forget the Hollywood version of moonlit castles and noble knights. Tonight, your bedroom is a graveyard. So before we dig ourselves in, do me a favour. If you actually enjoy these gloomy little bedtime dives, hit the like button and maybe subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe let the hum of your fan pretend it's the cold wind of the Middle Ages, and let's get started. You've just woken up in the year 1347. The good news? You found a place to sleep. The bad news? It's on top of someone who isn't sleeping at all. Your bed is the raw earth of a churchyard, still damp from last night's rain. Stones lean at crooked angles all around you, carved with crosses, prayers, or just badly scratched names already half worn away. A thin blanket clings to you, damp and heavy with mildew, and the ground beneath is soft, not because it's comfortable, but because someone was buried here last week. You roll to your side, only to feel the sharp edge of a bone pushing up through the soil. Congratulations again, your pillow has teeth. The air is heavy, a strange mix of incense drifting from the church and the sour stench of decay. Rats scurry along the graves, bold enough to sniff at your feet because food scraps from funeral feasts and half-buried remains make the perfect midnight buffet. Villagers whisper that rats gnaw at more than bodies, that they chew on the very souls of sinners. But right now you're more concerned with the one crawling across your ankle. And here's the medieval logic. This was safer than the woods. Graveyards were holy ground, watched over by the church, so demons were less likely to sneak up on you in the night. Of course, the irony is that people also feared graveyards as gateways where the dead slipped into the world of the living, which means when the mist curls low across the stones, you can never be sure if that's swamp gas or a spirit coming to check who's stolen its bed. When the church bell tolls midnight, the sound shudders through the ground beneath you. Some say it wakes the souls of the restless. Others claim the lights that flicker over graves, really just methane escaping, are lanterns carried by wandering spirits. Either way, you pull your ragged blanket tighter, because nothing is more unsettling than realizing your roommates are skeletons. And yet, this was life for countless peasants. Graveyards were free housing, tombstones made passable windbreaks, freshly dug soil meant softer ground than cobblestones, and lying close to holy ground gave the illusion of protection, even as bones pushed their way to the surface with every storm. This wasn't some rare horror story. This was survival, medieval style. So tonight, try to get some rest. Even as the mist thickens, the rats multiply, and the silence presses down heavier than the dirt itself. Because morning is coming, and when it does, the graveyard you used as a bedroom will become something very different indeed. By morning, the graveyard changes. The same patch of earth that cradled you through a night of damp soil and gnawing rats transforms into a bustling crossroads of medieval life. For in truth, cemeteries were not just quiet resting places for the dead. They were multi-purpose spaces in a world where no square foot of land went to waste. You may have slept in the mud beside a crumbling stone cross, but by sunrise, you're suddenly sitting in the medieval equivalent of a town square. Markets, meetings, punishments, gossip, even drunken brawls took place here. Imagine rolling over from your makeshift grave bed only to find yourself in the middle of a butcher, selling questionable cuts of meat, or a monk loudly lecturing on the sins of the community. Graveyards were central. The church was the heart of every village or town, and the cemetery hugged its walls. That meant if there was any gathering at all, it spilled into the graveyard. Fairs and feast days filled the space with stalls, colours and music. People set up makeshift booths right over burial mounds, laying out bread, cheese or trinkets on top of tombstones that were never meant to double as shop counters. It is one of those medieval contradictions that feels surreal today. Sacred ground, meant to honour the dead, was also where peasants haggled over salted fish, and children darted between gravestones playing games. And when night fell again, those same stones became pillows for the poor who could not afford even a corner of a cottage floor. One detail that never fails to unsettle modern minds is how close daily life was to decomposition. The churchyard was not isolated outside of town walls. It was right there in the thick of living, breathing humanity. That meant the smell of rot was not hidden. The practice of shallow graves or reused plots made sure of that. New graves were dug over old ones, sometimes disturbing bones and scattering them across the ground. People grew used to seeing skulls and femurs poking from the soil like macabre decorations. Some villages even stacked old bones in charnel houses, grim little sheds where the overflow of skeletons was arranged neatly for lack of space. Imagine grocery shopping with a pile of skulls stacked like firewood behind you. That was medieval normal. The church tried to balance reverence and practicality. Holy ground was valuable, so it had to serve both the dead and the living. Priests performed sermons just feet from where peasants sprawled drunk after a feast. Weddings spilled into the yard, as did fights between rival families. Executions sometimes happened within the cemetery walls, the belief being that dying on consecrated ground would purify the condemned. The effect was a grim absurdity. One day you could be watching a wedding under a flowering tree, the next day a thief might be hanged from the same branch. And if you were poor, you might still curl up to sleep under that tree at night, fleas biting as you wondered if the rope marks were still visible on the bark. Graveyards also drew animals. Dogs and cats roamed freely, rooting through disturbed earth or scraps left from feasts. Pigs were particularly notorious for rooting in churchyards, sometimes digging up shallow graves in search of food. Contemporary records complain about pigs wandering into cemeteries and unearthing bodies. For a peasant huddled between stones, the night could bring not just rats, but also a snorting hog shoving aside dirt. Holy ground did not mean clean ground. The medieval world teemed with life, and every animal from ravens to pigs had a part to play in the ecosystem of the graveyard. And then there was the fear. For all its practicality, the graveyard was also the most superstitious place in medieval imagination. It was thought that spirits could slip more easily into the world of the living here. The dead were restless, especially those buried without proper rites, or suicides, or criminals. The churchyard became a theatre of ghost stories. People swore they saw will-o'-the-wisps drifting between graves, faint blue lights that were actually gases released from decomposing bodies. But in the candle flicker world of medieval night, science did not exist to explain it. To them, those were souls wandering, perhaps looking for vengeance. When you bedded down among the tombs, you did not only fear cold or hunger, you feared being dragged into the unseen world before dawn. What makes this stranger still is how accepted it all was. No one thought twice about walking barefoot over a grave, or eating bread balanced on a stone slab, or sleeping beside someone who'd been lowered into the soil that morning. The modern obsession with separating life and death simply did not exist. Life was fragile, short, and constantly overshadowed by plague, famine, and war. The churchyard was both the beginning and the end, and everything in between. It is easy to forget how much business was conducted in the shadow of the tomb. Legal disputes were sometimes settled in the graveyard, with parties meeting in front of the church doors. Punishments could be handed out there too, like public penance, where wrongdoers knelt bare-kneed on cold stones while villagers jeered. For the poor who slept here, that meant waking up to the sight of someone being flogged only feet away. Imagine pulling your rag blanket over your head, trying to block out both the cold and the sound of whips cracking against skin. The sensory reality was inescapable. The ground was rarely dry. Rain pooled between stones, creating little bogs of mud where bodies rested beneath. In winter, frost froze the soil so hard that new graves had to wait until thaw, leaving corpses stacked in waiting sheds. The smell when spring arrived was overwhelming. Even if you could sleep through it, you carried the odour of the graveyard on your skin, hair, and clothes. Incense and holy water were sprinkled liberally, but neither was strong enough to mask centuries of decomposition. And yet, there was comfort here too, in the twisted way medieval life functioned. Sleeping in the graveyard meant you were close to the church, the centre of village protection, Bandits were less likely to bother you, demons were supposedly kept at bay, and you could blend in with the crowd during the day. It was grim, it was dirty, and it was terrifying. But it was also practical. A roof of stars was free, a tombstone made a decent wall, and holy ground at least gave you the illusion of safety. Morning in the graveyard brought with it the strangest reality of all, because as the bells rang and people poured into the yard for mass, you were suddenly surrounded by life again. Vendors set up their stalls, children chased each other around leaning stones, and drunkards stumbled home over the same dirt that would serve as your mattress again that night. No one stopped to question it. No one thought it unusual. The living and the dead shared the same space without hesitation. And as you rub your eyes, brushing away the mud and fleas from another restless night, you realize that this was the rhythm of medieval existence. The graveyard was never just a cemetery. It was a market, a courtroom, a playground, a banquet hall, and for the poor, the cheapest inn in town. And still, as strange as that sounds, there are darker truths waiting. For the graveyard was not only a place of sleep and commerce, it was also a place where medieval medicine, superstition, and even criminal enterprises thrived. The graveyard was more than a resting place, more than a bed for the desperate, and more than a public square for markets and brawls. It was also a pharmacy, a grim and frankly unhygienic pharmacy, where some of the most disturbing practices of medieval medicine drew their raw materials. For centuries, people believed that the bones, hair, and flesh of the dead contained curative powers. Powdered skulls were ground into fine dust and mixed into wine as a treatment for epilepsy. Mummy powder, a bizarre import from the Middle East, was thought to cure stomach ailments. The problem was that most medieval villages did not have access to exotic imports, so they looked to the graveyard right outside their door. Sleeping here meant you were surrounded not just by bones, but by ingredients waiting to be stolen, ground up, and sold to desperate patients. Night was when these activities thrived. Grave robbers prowled cemeteries, not always searching for valuables, but for body parts that could be resold to apothecaries. Fresh corpses were particularly valuable. Hair could be cut and sold as charms, nails could be clipped and used in folk remedies, and blood was sometimes gathered to treat conditions like leprosy or weakness. Imagine trying to fall asleep while a pair of shadowy figures digs a shallow trench beside you, not for a burial, but for harvesting what they believe to be medicinal gold. You tug your blanket tighter, not only to keep warm, but to convince yourself they are not looking at you as the freshest option. The fascination with the dead as medicine was not restricted to peasants. Kings and nobles dabbled in corpse cures too. The famous King's Drops, a concoction of powdered human skull mixed into alcohol, was used well into the Renaissance. The logic was simple in a grotesque way. If life had left the body, surely something of its essence remained, and consuming it would pass on vitality. This was not fringe belief, but mainstream. To medieval Europeans, the graveyard was not just sacred soil, but a stockroom of remedies. If you had a headache, you might rub powdered bone on your temples. If you had a persistent cough, you might drink a draught laced with ground mummy. The absurdity is that many of these remedies probably gave people worse stomach problems than they started with. This medical scavenging made graveyards even less restful. Every creak of wood, every crunch of soil at night could be a thief, a student of medicine, or a desperate neighbour trying to hack off a piece of someone recently buried. There are accounts of corpses being dug up within hours of burial, stripped of hair, teeth, and even fat, which was used in certain ointments believed to ease swelling. Sleeping nearby meant the night was never silent. There was always movement, always whispers, always the chance that what stirred the dirt beside you was not a ghost, but a human with a shovel and a recipe. Of course, superstition magnified these terrors. Many believed that parts of the body carried spiritual power. A finger bone might protect against evil spirits. A tooth could be strung into a necklace to ward off sickness. Even grave dirt itself was collected and used as an amulet, carried in little pouches tied to belts or hidden in homes. The irony is almost painful. You might spend the night coughing on damp soil only to realise that in the morning someone had scooped up that same dirt and sold it as a charm to keep nightmares away. The medieval graveyard was the ultimate paradox, both the source of nightmares and the supposed cure for them. And if you hoped that the church policed this, you would be disappointed. Officially, tampering with graves was a crime. Unofficially, it was rampant. Priests often turned a blind eye when the bones of the long dead were carted into charnel houses, rearranged or even distributed as relics. Relics themselves were a booming trade. Fingernails, scraps of cloth, fragments of bone, all supposedly tied to saints, but often just taken from the nearest graveyard. For someone sleeping among the stones, there was always the chance you were lying next to what the church considered a miracle waiting to be monetized. The atmosphere was anything but restful. The graves themselves were shallow, and the soil often shifted. Heavy rains would bring bones back to the surface, and people swore these remains held special potency. Some scooped rainwater that ran over fresh graves and drank it, convinced it carried healing properties. Imagine waking to a villager crouched beside you, collecting puddles off the mound you slept on, muttering prayers while filling a jug. In the medieval worldview, every corner of the cemetery was alive with possibility. Nothing went to waste, not even the seepage from the dead. There is another detail that makes your skin crawl. Executed criminals were often buried in graveyards, but in unmarked or marginalised corners. Their bodies were thought to carry a dangerous power, cursed but also useful in certain charms. Pieces of a hanged man's rope were prized for protection against illness. Flesh from executed thieves was sometimes boiled down for supposed cures. Sleeping here meant sharing your bed with the unlucky, the despised, and the dismembered, all of whom became part of a shadow economy that thrived in the very soil you tried to rest on. The sensory overload was relentless. At night the air was damp and cold, carrying the metallic tang of earth mixed with the sweeter, sicklier odour of decay. You breathed it in whether you wanted to or not, and villagers claimed the smell itself could be healing if inhaled near holy ground. During the day, the atmosphere shifted, filled with smoke from vendors cooking food, incense from the church, and the stench of pigs that rooted freely in the graves. For you, lying half hidden in the shadows, it was a kaleidoscope of odours, each more unpleasant than the last, each somehow woven into the fabric of daily survival. And yet, as grotesque as it sounds, this strange mingling of life, death, and medicine made sense to the medieval mind. Death was everywhere. It was sudden, unavoidable, and woven into existence. Why not look to the dead for solutions to the problems of the living? The cemetery was the ultimate pharmacy because it was the ultimate reminder that life was fragile. Sleep was not peaceful here. It was a transaction, a gamble, a way to survive one more night by resting in the very place where survival had already failed for so many others. But even with the constant disturbance of grave robbers and superstition, there were other threats lurking. For the cemetery was not just a pharmacy, it was also a courtroom, a place of punishment, and a stage for public humiliation. And if you thought sleeping beside the dead was unsettling, try waking to the sound of justice being carried out only a few feet away. The cemetery was never silent, and not only because of rats and restless mourners. It was also the stage for punishment, a theatre of shame where sins were displayed in full view of the living and the dead. The churchyard was the perfect setting for this strange brand of medieval justice. Everyone passed through it, everyone gathered there for mass, and everyone knew it was consecrated ground. That made it the ideal place to drag wrongdoers for public humiliation. Sleeping among the tombstones meant you sometimes woke to the sound of a whip cracking, or the guttural sobs of someone being forced to kneel half naked on the icy stones as penance. The smell of incense from the church mixed with the smell of sweat, blood, and mud, creating a perfume of punishment that no medieval nose could ever escape. Penances varied, but they were all meant to sting the body as much as the soul. Some involved fasting for weeks, others demanded that sinners lie prostrate in the graveyard during Mass. letting the entire congregation step over them on their way inside. The punishment was not private, it was a performance. Neighbours jeered, children pointed, and merchants carried on selling bread only a few feet away, while someone did penance for fornication or theft. Sleeping here meant you were surrounded by constant reminders of morality, or at least morality as the church defined it. Imagine dozing off on a grave mound only to be awakened by a priest's booming voice condemning someone for gossiping too loudly or skipping fast days. Your bed doubled as a courtroom, your blankets as courtroom benches, and your only escape was pretending to still be asleep, while a crowd of villagers clapped as a man was flogged for stealing a chicken. Executions also found their way into graveyards, and this gave the place an even darker edge. While hanging usually took place outside city gates, certain towns used churchyards as sites for swift justice. The logic was twisted but consistent with medieval thinking. Dying on consecrated soil meant the criminal might have one last chance at salvation. For everyone else, it was a show. Crowds gathered, prayers were chanted, ropes tightened, and another soul was dispatched directly from the noose to the grave. For those who slept here, it was a brutal reminder that the ground you used as a mattress might be the same ground where a thief had been buried earlier that day. And in a time when bones often resurfaced, you could never be entirely sure whose remains you were lying beside. What unsettles the modern mind is how normalised all of this was. Medieval villagers thought nothing of eating and drinking in a space that doubled as a court, a gallows, and a dormitory. Sacredness and spectacle existed side by side without contradiction. The very stones you leaned against for warmth might have been the same ones a sinner was tied to for whipping the previous week. The same holy earth that promised peace for the soul was also where lawbreakers were broken in front of everyone they knew. It gave the graveyard a dual nature that seeped into every part of life. Reverence mixed with fear, prayer mixed with cruelty, and the line between justice and spectacle blurred until no one could tell the difference. At night, these echoes of punishment lingered. The graveyard was never just a bed of cold dirt. It was a place soaked with the memory of screams, the sting of whips, and the sight of bodies left as warnings. Villagers believed that criminals buried without rites were restless, their spirits condemned to wander. Sleeping in those corners of the cemetery meant every gust of wind or flicker of moonlight could feel like the brush of a ghost hand. If you coughed in your sleep, some would say it was not the damp night air but the spirit of a thief breathing down your neck. For the poor who had nowhere else to rest, it was a constant gamble between warmth, superstition, and the reminder that the ground beneath you was both holy and haunted. This atmosphere was heightened during feast days and festivals. Crowds filled the churchyard, not only for worship but also for games, drinking and merriment. And while merriment flourished in daylight, punishment never stopped. Someone could be flogged at dawn, a wedding could be celebrated at noon, and a drunken brawl could spill over at dusk. By the time the poor curled up for the night, the soil was trampled flat, the air thick with the residue of wine, and the stones carried fresh stains from whatever justice had been carried out that day. Imagine trying to sleep on ground that was part dance floor, part courtroom, and part execution ground, all within the span of a single day. Even animals were roped into this cycle of punishment. Records describe pigs being publicly executed for killing children, goats being put on trial for trampling fields, and dogs punished for biting nobles. These bizarre spectacles sometimes took place in or near the graveyard, since it was a central space where everyone could gather. For someone bedding down there at night, the echoes of the day's absurdities were unavoidable. You might find yourself drifting to sleep while staring at the same post where a goat had been tied up and whipped for a crime only humans could have invented. It sounds comical now, but to medieval villagers it was deadly serious, a way of proving that even animals fell under divine law. The blending of sacred and punitive rituals left its mark on every part of the medieval cemetery. To sleep there was to live inside that contradiction. You were cradled by the protection of holy ground, yet constantly reminded that the same soil was used for punishment, penance, and public shame. The stones were carved with prayers but stained with blood. The air carried hymns on Sundays but also curses shouted at criminals on market days. And your blanket of damp earth never let you forget that life and death, reverence and cruelty, holiness and horror all occupied the same square of ground without hesitation. And still, as unsettling as that was, the graveyard had more faces. For it was also a place of feasting, of revelry, of drunken nights where the living forgot their dead neighbours for a while and turned the cemetery into a tavern without walls. And if you thought sleep was difficult, surrounded by penance and punishment, try closing your eyes while a feast rages over your head and the bones of saints are used as table decorations. The graveyard did not always echo with prayers, screams, or silence. Sometimes it rang with laughter, music, and the clinking of mugs. For all the reverence that holy ground was supposed to demand, medieval people treated cemeteries as extensions of daily life, and that included eating, drinking, and celebrating right on top of the dead. Feasts spilled into churchyards on holy days, families brought food to share with neighbours, and travellers found the stones a convenient place to lean while sipping ale. Sleeping here meant that your midnight lullaby could just as easily be a drunken ballad as a tolling bell. Churchyards were among the few open spaces in crowded towns, which made them natural gathering places. Weddings often included outdoor banquets that spilled into the graveyard, with tables set up over old mounds, decorated with flowers pulled from plots still marking the dead. Children darted between tombstones while adults gorged themselves on roasted meats, pottage, and rivers of beer. To modern ears it sounds disrespectful, but to them it was simply practical. Space was limited, and holy ground already had the blessing of the church, which meant it was safer than the lawless fields outside the town. The only drawback was that spilled wine and food scraps mixed with the soil and bones, which made the graveyard a paradise for rats and pigs. That did not stop people from returning again and again to celebrate in the shadow of the tombs. The drinking culture was central. Ale was safer than water, so it flowed freely during every gathering. Graveyards became informal taverns, especially during festivals. Large jugs of weak beer were passed around, stronger brews for the wealthy, and cheap sour varieties for the poor. The ground itself absorbed centuries of spilled alcohol, giving the soil the smell of a tavern floor. For someone trying to sleep there, it meant you might drift off surrounded by the sounds of belching, snoring, and drunken arguments. Archaeologists have even found fragments of jugs and pottery in medieval cemeteries, evidence of feasts where revellers smashed their cups when the drink ran out. Imagine curling under your blanket while shards of pottery crunch under your shoulder, leftovers from yesterday's party among the dead. Feasting was not always light-hearted. On All Souls' Day, families brought food directly to the graves of loved ones, setting out bread, cheese, or even ale for the departed. Sometimes the living ate with the dead, picnicking beside tombs while believing the spirits would join them invisibly. This was not morbid to the medieval mind. It was a gesture of care, proof that the boundary between life and death was thinner than modern people imagine. For someone bedding down in that same spot at night, it meant sleeping among scraps of offerings, half-chewed bread, and cups left tipped against stones, a banquet abandoned but still buzzing with superstition. The line between feast and chaos was thin. Records from medieval towns describe drunken brawls breaking out in cemeteries after weddings or saints' festivals. Knives were drawn, fists swung, and stones themselves were sometimes used as weapons. To spend the night here was to lie in the aftermath of these scuffles, the soil marked with blood and broken bottles. Some graveyards became notorious for their rowdiness, so much so that laws were passed in certain regions banning feasts within churchyards. Of course, those bans were largely ignored. When the church bell called people to mass, it also called them to celebration afterward, and the graveyard was the most obvious place to hold it. Even more unsettling was the mingling of food with death. During times of famine, graveyards were not just feasting grounds, but also hunting grounds for anything remotely edible. Pigs let loose to forage often dug up shallow graves, and there are accounts of starving villagers following them in hopes of salvaging meat. The line between sacred feast and grim desperation blurred completely in those moments. If you tried to sleep through such nights, the sound of pigs rooting near graves was enough to keep you awake, each snort a reminder that the feast could turn into horror at any moment. The sensory landscape was overwhelming, the air filled with roasting meat, spilled beer, and the sickly sweet odour of incense still burning from earlier services. The ground was littered with bones, both human and animal, some used as tools to stir food or as tokens in drinking games. Music echoed through the yard, lutes and drums played loudly while singers belted out tunes about saints, love, or even bawdy jokes. Imagine pulling your ragged blanket over your head to block the noise, only to realise the tombstone beside you has become the drum for a group of laughing men pounding out a rhythm with wooden spoons. These celebrations reflected the medieval view that life and death were inseparable. To feast among the dead was not an insult but an acknowledgement. Death was everywhere, and ignoring it was impossible. Better to eat, drink, and be merry in its shadow than pretend it was not there. The graveyard was not only a resting place, but also a constant reminder to live while you could. It was philosophy written in spilled wine and muddy footprints, each feast a declaration that life was short and should be savoured even if it meant sleeping beside bones at the end of the night. For the poor who made the cemetery their bed, these feasts were both blessing and curse. Leftovers meant free food, and sometimes you could scavenge enough to survive another day. But it also meant noise, danger, and the risk of being trampled if the party grew too wild. Sleep was fragile in those hours, punctuated by the shouts of drunkards or the sudden crash of a table overturned in a brawl. By morning the ground was littered with scraps, and you woke not just hungry but surrounded by half-rotted food, spilled ale, and bones stirred from their resting places. The contradictions were endless. Holy hymns by day, wild feasts by night, sacred offerings beside drunken scraps, children laughing beside the bones of their ancestors. The graveyard was not just a space of mourning or fear. It was a stage where life itself played out in its most chaotic forms, and to sleep there meant you became part of that drama whether you wanted to or not. And yet, as noisy and absurd as the feasts were, they were nothing compared to what happened when death arrived in numbers too great to ignore. For graveyards were not just homes, taverns and theatres. They were also the dumping grounds of plague, when death did not come one by one but in floods that overwhelmed every stone, every wall, every inch of consecrated soil. When plague swept through Europe, the graveyard was no longer a bed for the desperate or a playground for children. It became a bottomless pit for the dead. Waves of disease like the Black Death in the mid-14th century pushed cemeteries far past their limits, forcing the living to improvise in ways that were as shocking as they were grimly practical. For those who still tried to sleep among the stones, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The ground you curled up on by night could be dug open by morning, filled with bodies stacked like cordwood, covered quickly, and then reopened the next day for more. The graveyard became less of a resting place, and more of a conveyor belt of mortality. During the height of the Black Death, it was not uncommon for hundreds to be buried in a single parish within a week. Traditional graves gave way to trenches, long pits where dozens of bodies were layered together, each covered with a thin sprinkling of dirt before the next wave arrived. Contemporary accounts describe the horror vividly. Chroniclers wrote of gravediggers collapsing from exhaustion, priests too overwhelmed to perform proper rites, and carts rattling through towns piled high with corpses. Imagine trying to rest in that environment, where the sound of shovels never stopped, where the earth was constantly disturbed, and where your bed was inches away from freshly buried plague victims. The stench alone was enough to drive people to nausea, yet those with nowhere else to go still lay down to sleep on the same ground. The odour was unlike anything else. Decay, disease, and damp soil created a miasma so thick that medieval people believed it could infect anyone who breathed it. And in a way, they were not entirely wrong. Rats and fleas carried plague, but the sheer presence of decomposing bodies in shallow pits created an environment where sickness thrived. Sleeping in such a place meant every breath carried risk. You inhaled the mingled scent of death and incense, of hastily burned herbs and rotting flesh. People stuffed lavender, rosemary, or vinegar-soaked cloths in their nostrils, hoping to block the miasma. If you were poor and had no such protection, you simply endured, half believing that each lungful of graveyard air was bringing the disease closer. The sheer scale of burial sometimes broke every custom of respect. Bodies were stripped of clothing to be reused by the living, coffins abandoned as too expensive, and markers skipped entirely. Skeletons piled atop one another until the soil itself seemed made of bone. Archaeologists have uncovered plague pits where remains were hastily arranged in rows, evidence of workers trying to be efficient in the face of catastrophe. Sleeping here meant that the line between mattress and grave blurred completely. You lay on soil so saturated with human remains that you could not tell where one burial ended and another began. For the medieval poor, the graveyard was not just the cheapest inn. It was the most crowded one, with neighbours far too close for comfort. Even in such horror, absurdity found a way to creep in. Some believed that burying plague victims with quicklime would neutralise the danger, so pits were dusted with the caustic powder, creating a chemical soup that burned the skin of anyone unlucky enough to step or sleep near it. Others insisted on burying victims with charms or coins to ward off restless spirits, only for thieves to sneak back and dig through the corpses in search of valuables. Imagine dozing off against a stone only to be awakened by a thief sifting through plague pits with bare hands, convinced that holy trinkets buried with the dead would keep him safe. The social chaos added to the nightmare. Families often abandoned their dead, leaving them at cemetery gates for gravediggers to handle. Entire communities collapsed under the weight of mortality, and cemeteries filled so fast that bodies were left exposed, half-covered, or dumped in mass piles until space could be found. Stray animals picked at them. Birds circled overhead. For the poor who slept there, the night was alive not only with rats, but with the tearing sounds of scavengers. Sleep was almost impossible, yet the graveyard still offered what little security holy ground could provide, and so people stayed, even as they pressed themselves into the soil of death itself. The rituals of mourning dissolved. Bells tolled constantly until their sound became background noise. Funerals were abbreviated to a few hurried prayers, and mourners stood at a distance to avoid infection. Entire graveyards overflowed, forcing new cemeteries to be established outside towns, but even these filled quickly. The desperate solution was trench after trench, each one dug so shallow that heavy rains uncovered bodies anew. For someone sleeping in that chaos, the ground shifted beneath you, literally and figuratively. What had been a bed of damp earth one night might be a fresh burial mound the next morning, soft with unsettled soil and heavy with the smell of recent death. And yet medieval people continued to use these places as social and spiritual centres. Even during plague, the cemetery was where people gathered to pray, where survivors begged for mercy, and where the rituals of community persisted. Sleeping in the middle of it meant you absorbed every sound, every sight, every stench. The graveyard was not quiet mourning. It was relentless, noisy, chaotic, and terrifying. The absurdity is that despite the horror, the cemetery still carried the promise of protection. Being close to holy ground was thought to shield the living from restless spirits, even when that holy ground was piled high with plague dead. The contradiction was woven into medieval life. The cemetery was at once sanctuary and nightmare, a place of hope and of decay. For those who had no other home, it was where they laid their heads, even as the ground itself threatened to swallow them whole. And still, plague was not the only danger to shape the cemetery. Beyond disease and decay, graveyards became hiding places, refuges for thieves, soldiers, and fugitives who used the stones as cover and the darkness as an ally. To lie down among the dead was one thing. To wake and find yourself sharing the graveyard with the living who carried knives, swords, or worse was another altogether. Graveyards did not only belong to the poor, the sick, or the grieving. They also belonged to those with something to hide. In a medieval world without CCTV or street lamps, the churchyard was one of the best places to vanish. A landscape of crooked stones, deep shadows, and the constant fear of spirits that kept most honest villagers away after dark. For thieves, deserters, and wandering soldiers, this made the cemetery a perfect refuge. And if you were unlucky enough to be trying to sleep there, you often found yourself sharing your bed with men who carried knives and had no intention of being quiet. Soldiers in particular used graveyards as temporary camps, especially when moving through enemy territory or slipping away from their units. During the 100 Years' War, chronicles describe deserters hiding in churchyards, blending in with the poor and waiting until night to move on. The reasoning was simple. Holy ground carried a kind of immunity. Local villagers were less likely to interfere, and authorities hesitated to drag men out of consecrated soil for fear of offending the church. To lie there as a beggar meant you might be mistaken for one of them, curled in the dirt beside a soldier nursing wounds or sharpening a blade. Sleep came cautiously, with the knowledge that the man next to you was as likely to slit your purse as to share his fire. Criminals also favoured the cemetery. Outlaws on the run used tombs as landmarks, meeting points, or hiding spots for stolen goods. A hollow carved into a stone slab was as good as a lockbox. For someone curled up in the graveyard, the night could suddenly turn busy, as shadowy figures appear to stash valuables under a cross, or dig shallow holes to conceal coins and weapons. Archaeologists have occasionally found caches of objects buried suspiciously close to graves, suggesting that cemeteries doubled as medieval safes. Of course, this meant you sometimes woke to the sound of men whispering above you, their shovels cutting into the earth, their eyes darting to make sure no one was watching. In a place where spirits were feared more than thieves, they often went unchallenged. The irony is that the church itself sometimes encouraged this. Medieval law often allowed fugitives to claim sanctuary in holy places, including cemeteries. A murderer could flee to a churchyard and be immune from immediate arrest, protected for a period of time while the case was debated. The poor who slept there did not just share space with fellow paupers, they shared it with killers, robbers, and deserters who had thrown themselves on the mercy of the church. For you, trying to close your eyes against the cold, that meant your neighbour might be a farmer one night, and a man who had just committed a bloody crime the next. The sensory reality of sharing space with fugitives was jarring. The graveyard was already noisy enough with rats, bells, and the occasional feast, but add to that the metallic scrape of swords being sharpened, the muttered curses of men on the run, and the sour stench of leather armour soaked in sweat. Soldiers rarely smelled of roses, and hiding in graveyards did nothing to improve their odour. Sleep was punctuated by the clink of chainmail, the shuffle of boots, and the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching to see if you carried anything worth stealing. Even worse, fights broke out. Graveyards were dark, crowded, and filled with men who distrusted one another. Thieves argued over spoils, deserters brawled over food, and the poor who slept there were often caught in the middle. Chroniclers note that brawls sometimes spilled into churchyards after taverns closed, and with soldiers present, blades were drawn as quickly as fists. For someone already huddled against the cold earth, this turned your bed into a front row seat at yet another medieval spectacle, complete with blood on the stones and curses shouted into the night. Superstition added another layer of unease. Many believed that violent men who died without confession would haunt the place of their last crime. Sleeping beside armed fugitives meant you were not only at risk from their blades in life, but also from their ghosts in death. The villagers whispered that soldiers who died in cemeteries rose again to march at night, doomed to wander the stones forever as punishment for breaking sanctuary. Whether you believed it or not, it was impossible to ignore the eerie way armour clinked in the wind, or how shadows stretched unnaturally across the graves. Yet there was a twisted comfort in their presence too. A soldier hiding in the graveyard might fend off wild dogs or scare away drunks who got too close. A thief might share food or fire, even if it came from stolen goods. Life in medieval Europe was rarely about choosing safety. It was about choosing the least dangerous option, and sometimes that meant curling up beside the very men who terrified everyone else. The logic was brutal but clear. If you slept with the soldiers, perhaps their knives would protect you, not cut you. This gave the graveyard an entirely different character. It was no longer just a place of mourning, punishment, or feasting. It was a barracks of the unwanted, a shifting camp of deserters, outlaws, and beggars, all using the same ground for cover. By day, the church bell rang out holy hymns, but by night the same stones echoed with the hiss of whetstones, the crunch of boots, and the mutter of men who trusted no one. For the medieval poor trying to survive among them, sleep was never deep. It was a shallow half-consciousness, one ear always open, one eye always ready to flick open at the sound of steel. The contradictions of the graveyard grew sharper the longer you stayed. In the morning, priests led processions through the same stones where deserters had sharpened swords. Children played beside tombs that only hours earlier hid stolen goods. Weddings marched through a space still haunted by the curses of thieves. To live and sleep in such a place was to exist inside a paradox, a world where sanctuary and danger overlapped so completely that you could not tell them apart. And still, as unsettling as soldiers and fugitives were, they were not the only human threats lurking among the stones. The cemeteries also doubled as meeting places for secret societies, forbidden rituals, and midnight dealings that the church would never have sanctioned by daylight. If you thought graveyards were noisy with drunks and deserters, imagine what happened when the occultists showed up with candles, bones, and whispered invocations. The graveyard at night was never entirely quiet, even when no brawls broke out and no soldiers sharpened blades in the shadows. Sometimes it filled with whispers of a different kind, the low chants of villagers seeking more than shelter. Medieval people lived in a world dripping with superstition, where death was not an ending but a door left slightly ajar. That made the cemetery an irresistible place for rituals, charms, and all manner of occult experiments. If you were trying to sleep among the stones, you were as likely to be disturbed by a circle of candlelight as by a rat crawling across your blanket. Bones carried power. At least that was the belief. Digging up a skull could give you protection against illness, or let you glimpse the future if you placed it under your pillow. Teeth were strung into necklaces to ward off evil spirits. Grave dirt was scooped into little pouches and carried as talismans. The irony was impossible to miss. The same mud that clung to your face after a damp night's sleep was carefully bottled by someone else as a cure against nightmares. For the medieval mind, the graveyard was a storehouse of raw spiritual material. It was not only where the poor slept, it was where the fearful and the curious came to collect bits of the dead, hoping to bribe fate in their favour. The church fought hard against these practices, but the harder it pushed, the more creative people became. Records describe villagers sneaking into cemeteries at midnight to light candles on graves, not in honour of the dead, but to harness their supposed energy. Some would leave offerings of bread, milk or ale to spirits, hoping to earn good luck in return. Others performed divination rituals, dropping melted wax into water or drawing symbols in the dirt with bones. Imagine trying to keep your eyes shut while a group of villagers gathers around a mound beside you, whispering prayers mixed with half-pagan incantations, their candles flickering against the stones. The line between Christian devotion and old-world superstition blurred constantly, and the cemetery was the perfect place to blur it further. The fascination with the occult reached even stranger levels when soldiers and mercenaries joined in. Battlefield life was brutal, and superstition ran deep in the ranks. Some soldiers carried bone charms for protection in combat, convinced that the spirit of the dead could shield them from arrows. Others swore that graveyard rituals could make them invisible to enemies or give them strength. Cemeteries near battlefields became crowded not just with corpses but with living men scratching strange symbols into the dirt, muttering words they barely understood, desperate for any edge in war. For those who slept there, this meant your neighbours were not only beggars and fugitives, but also nervous soldiers pacing with candles and bones, trying to convince themselves they were invincible. Not all rituals were harmless. Graveyards became sites of fear when rumours spread of witches using bones or corpse parts for spells. Authorities hunted for evidence of necromancy, and accusations often centred on midnight gatherings in cemeteries. Some believed witches dug up unbaptized infants to use their remains in potions, a claim both horrifying and convenient for those eager to blame women for any misfortune. The fear of these rituals was so strong that in some regions, cemeteries posted guards at night to keep people away from the graves. Yet the guards themselves often ended up asleep on duty, leaving the poor who lay there to witness the occasional figure cloaked in shadow, carrying a candle and muttering words meant for no living ears. Superstition also dictated how people behaved in daily life. Walking across a grave was thought to invite misfortune. Sleeping too close to the north side of a cemetery could bring nightmares. Eating food in a graveyard risked attracting spirits who would linger with you afterward. And yet all of these rules were constantly broken. Feasts spilled onto the stones, poor families curled up on the north wall, and bones were used as tools and toys. The contradiction was constant, but it fit perfectly with the medieval worldview. The graveyard was holy and haunted, sacred and practical, dangerous and useful, all at once. For someone trying to sleep through it all, the sounds of superstition never ended. Candles sputtered, wax dripping onto cold slabs, murmurs carried on the night air, sometimes prayers, sometimes something far stranger. Occasionally the wind lifted loose parchment from a ritual gone wrong, scraps of words scrawled in Latin or symbols carved into the dirt. The living and the dead were never alone here. They mingled in the flickering firelight, and you, lying in the middle of it, could not help but wonder if the shadows moving at the edge of your vision were men or something older. The graveyard did not need ghosts to be terrifying. Human imagination did the work just fine. Every superstition, every ritual, every whispered charm was proof of how desperate people were to make sense of the thin line between life and death. To live in a world where plague, famine and war struck without warning was to crave any edge you could find, even if it meant digging in the dirt beside the dead. And if you had no choice but to sleep there, you became part of that world whether you believed or not. You lay in the middle of their fears and their rituals, a witness to both faith and folly, as the medieval graveyard whispered its secrets into the night. And yet, even amid the superstitions and rituals, the cemetery had another role to play. One less mystical, but no less strange. It was not just a place for sleeping, hiding, or invoking spirits. It was also a business, a source of income, a financial machine where space was rented, relics were sold, and every inch of soil had a price. To lie down among the graves was to lie at the centre of the medieval economics, where death was not only sacred but profitable. The medieval graveyard was never free real estate, at least not if the church had anything to say about it. Every square foot of consecrated soil came with a price tag, and the dead paid for it just as much as the living. Burials were not random holes in the ground. They were carefully managed plots of land that could make or break a church's finances. To sleep among the stones at night was to lie on property that was constantly negotiated, rented, and reused. The soil beneath you was a ledger, every mound a line of credit, every stone a receipt carved in Latin. Proximity mattered. The closer your grave was to the church walls, the more it cost. The holiest ground was right against the building itself, sometimes literally under the eaves where rainwater dripping off the roof was thought to carry blessings. Wealthy families paid heavily for those spots, convinced that being buried within spitting distance of the altar meant a shorter layover in purgatory. The poor, of course, were shoved toward the edges, crammed together in shallow pits that doubled as your bed when you curled up on them. Even in death, medieval society kept its hierarchy neat and tidy. You could tell how important someone was by how close you tripped over their grave on the way to Mass. The business did not stop at burial fees. Relics were a booming trade, and graveyards provided an endless supply of raw material. a fragment of bone could be presented as a saint's relic, and few villagers dared to question it. The church could claim that a thumb bone belonged to a holy martyr, when in reality it might just be old Thomas from 2 villages over. Pilgrims flocked to these relics, dropping coins and offerings, and the church profited. For those sleeping nearby, it meant your neighbour under the soil might have already been divided into lucrative parts, with one bone in a reliquary and the rest left in the ground. The graveyard was as much a marketplace for spiritual goods as it was a resting place for bodies. Fees piled up at every stage. Families paid for funeral masses, for candles, for bells to be tolled, for prayers to be recited over the body. Even the gravedigger's labour came with a charge, and if the family could not pay, the burial was delayed or the grave was shallow. In some places, poor families were forced to share graves, with bodies stacked 2 or 3 deep, each layer representing a cheaper option. Archaeologists uncovering medieval cemeteries often find multiple skeletons in single pits, evidence that poverty even followed you into the afterlife. For the homeless poor who slept in the same yard, the irony was bitter. You could not afford a bed in life, and you could not afford one in death either. The economics extended to the living as well. Graveyards charged for grazing rights, allowing animals to feed on the grass between stones. Cows, sheep and goats wandered freely, munching on weeds that grew thick in the nutrient-rich soil of centuries of burials. If you lay down to sleep, you risked being nudged awake by a cow nosing through your blanket or a goat nibbling your hair. To the church, it was simply another stream of income. To you, it was one more indignity of making your bed in a cemetery where livestock roamed as freely as souls. The graves themselves were temporary investments, space was limited, and the living kept dying. That meant old graves were routinely dug up, the bones gathered into ossuaries or charnel houses, and the plots resold. The bones of the long dead were stacked like firewood inside chapels, or piled neatly in crypts, where skulls stared out through iron grills as grim reminders of mortality. The Latin phrase memento mori, remember you must die, was written across walls lined with femurs. To medieval minds, this recycling was not disrespectful but efficient. To the poor who slept there, it meant the ground was always unsettled, always being turned, always shifting under your body as if the soil itself had no patience for permanence. And the absurdity reached further. There were fees for burial shrouds, fees for wooden markers, and in some towns, even fees for moving the body through the streets on the way to the cemetery. If you died in debt, your family might struggle to afford your burial, and in extreme cases, bodies were left unburied until payment was made. This was less a religious institution than a medieval subscription plan, with the dead locked out until their accounts were settled. Imagine lying in the graveyard and hearing arguments at the gate over whether a body could be allowed in, as if death itself required paperwork. The economics also extended to indulgences. Wealthy families could pay priests to pray for the souls of their dead relatives, shortening their stay in purgatory. These prayers could be repeated annually, generating steady revenue for the church. The poor, of course, had no such luxury. Their souls lingered longer, their graves were shallower, and their families were less likely to afford candles or bells. To sleep in the cemetery meant listening to the bells toll longer for some than for others, each clang a reminder that salvation, like land, could be bought if you had enough coin. And yet, for all the costs, the graveyard still served as the only affordable bed for many. At least you could lie there without being charged rent, even if the ground beneath you was constantly being resold to someone else. Your bed was free, but only because it was too muddy, too cold, and too close to the bones of men whose families had already paid dearly for the privilege of resting closer to God. The medieval graveyard was capitalism wrapped in holy robes, a place where money flowed as steadily as prayers, and where the poor found themselves trampled not only in life but in death as well. And still, even this economic machine was not the strangest feature of medieval cemeteries, for beyond the fees, the relics, and the resold graves, the graveyard also belonged to creatures that paid no coin at all. Rats, crows, dogs and pigs treated the cemetery as their hunting ground, making every night's sleep a gamble between fleas, feathers and teeth. The medieval graveyard was never only for the living and the dead, it was also for the creatures in between, the animals that treated it as pasture, pantry and playground. Sleep here long enough, and you would discover that rats were only the beginning. Entire armies of scavengers prowled the stones by night and day, each turning the cemetery into their private buffet. For the poor who lay on the earth, the company was constant and rarely welcome. You did not just share your bed with bones and neighbours, you shared it with a medieval food chain. Rats swarmed first, and they came in numbers beyond imagination. Medieval cities were overrun with them, drawn to the grain stores, refuse heaps, and above all the shallow graves of cemeteries. Fresh soil was an invitation, and rats quickly gnawed their way into coffins, dragging out scraps of flesh, gnawing on bone, and leaving trails of fleas in their wake. These fleas carried bubonic plague, making every squeak in the darkness a potential death sentence. To lie in the graveyard was to feel them scamper across your ankles, their tiny claws scratching, their bodies darting in and out of the folds of your blanket. In a way, you were the only living body they ignored because the dead beneath you were easier prey. But rats were not alone. Dogs prowled cemeteries, both strays and half-tamed mongrels belonging to villagers. In famine years, they dug up graves in search of food, pulling limbs from the dirt and scattering bones across the yard. Chroniclers recorded the horror of seeing dogs carrying human arms or gnawing on skulls, an image so grotesque that priests sometimes organised hunts to kill the strays. Imagine trying to drift into uneasy sleep while a dog padded past your head, a jawbone clamped in its mouth like a stick. The sound of crunching was not firewood but marrow. Crows and ravens circled endlessly, their harsh cries echoing above the stones. They fed on anything left exposed, from the scraps of food after feasts to the bodies hastily buried during plague years. In some places, villagers even believed that the presence of ravens was a divine sign, proof that the souls of the dead were being escorted to the next world. To you, lying in the dirt, they were less divine and more deafening, their wings beating the air as they hopped along stones and pecked at scraps inches from your face. Crows became so tied to cemeteries that they still haunt Gothic imagination today, but in the Middle Ages they were not symbols, they were scavengers fattened on decay. Pigs were perhaps the most notorious intruders. Allowed to roam freely in many towns, they rooted in graveyards with single-minded persistence, their snouts digging into fresh earth, overturning soil, and occasionally hauling out entire limbs. Records from medieval courts describe pigs being tried and executed for desecrating graves, or even killing children who strayed too close. The idea that an animal could face trial might sound absurd, but it reflects just how disruptive pigs were in everyday life. In the graveyard, they were both nuisance and nightmare. For those trying to sleep there, the sound of a pig snuffling at the edge of your blanket was not only disgusting but genuinely dangerous. A hungry sow could overturn soil, trample you, or worse. It was bad enough that you shared your bed with corpses. Sharing it with livestock that chewed on them made rest almost impossible. Cats too haunted the yard, though not for the dead themselves. They came for the rats stalking through the grass, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. Villagers sometimes saw cats weaving between stones at night and believed them to be witches' familiars, demonic creatures feeding off the energy of the grave. In truth, they were doing pest control, keeping the rat population at least partially in check. But if you woke in the night and saw glowing eyes fixed on you from atop a tomb, it was difficult to believe they were anything other than supernatural. Cats made the graveyard both more bearable and more terrifying, a symbol of superstition and sanitation rolled into one. Even insects had their role. Beetles and flies swarmed in warmer months, crawling across skin, buzzing in ears, drawn to both the living bodies of sleepers and the dead beneath them. Medieval people had no insect repellent, no netting, no defence other than swatting and praying. The idea that disease came from foul air, miasma, made these insects doubly frightening. Their presence was seen as proof that the graveyard air itself was dangerous, thick with death. To close your eyes at night was to let them crawl over you, their tiny legs marching across your face as if you were already part of the feast. The interaction between humans and animals in cemeteries was not just nuisance, it was symbolic. Villagers saw pigs unearthing graves and interpreted it as divine punishment for sin. Crows feeding on corpses were warnings that the dead were unquiet. Dogs carrying bones were omens of bad harvests or bad weather. Sleeping there meant you lived in the middle of these interpretations, a witness to the way animals turned ordinary hunger into cosmic meaning. Every snuffle, every flap of wings, every gnawed bone became part of the medieval imagination of death. And yet the church profited from it too. Grazing rights were sold, allowing sheep and cattle into graveyards to keep grass trimmed. This meant you sometimes woke to the heavy breath of a cow standing above you, chewing methodically while staring down with placid eyes. To medieval villagers, this was tidy and useful. To you, lying in the mud, it was another reminder that your bed was as much a pasture as a holy ground. The graveyard as an ecosystem was never still. It was alive with creatures great and small, each gnawing, pecking, rooting or buzzing, each turning the sacred into the grotesquely practical. To the medieval mind, this was natural, a reminder that life and death fed one another in endless cycles. To you, trying to rest there, it was simply exhausting. The dead did not stay buried, the animals did not stay out, and your body did not stay untouched. Every night was a battle not just with cold and fear, but with the relentless hunger of the creatures that ruled the stones. And still, beyond animals and scavengers, graveyards had yet another role. They were not only ecosystems, pharmacies or marketplaces, they were also stages for politics and power, places where soldiers assembled, oaths were sworn, and authority was displayed among the bones. The same ground that pigs rooted through was also where kings proclaimed laws and armors gathered for war. The medieval graveyard was not only for mourners, beggars or beasts, it was also a place where politics played out in the open, where soldiers gathered in formation, and where rulers staged their power directly among the dead. In a world without town halls or central squares large enough for everyone, the churchyard became the default stage for authority. To sleep here meant you sometimes woke up not to bells or pigs, but to the sound of armoured boots stamping the earth, soldiers lined up between tombstones, and proclamations shouted over the bones of ancestors. Military oaths were often sworn in cemeteries. Knights pledged loyalty before altars inside the church, while common soldiers gathered outside among the graves. The ground itself was sacred, making any oath hard to break, at least in theory. Chronicles describe mercenaries lining up with swords raised, their voices echoing as they swore to fight for a lord's cause. The irony, of course, was that many of these same men deserted weeks later, sometimes hiding again in the very same graveyards when the campaign soured. For those trying to sleep under the wall that night, it meant the holy soil that was your mattress by evening had been a makeshift parade ground by morning. Assemblies of power also took place here. Kings and lords announced edicts in churchyards because it guaranteed an audience. Everyone came to mass, so everyone would hear the law afterward. The sight must have been surreal. A royal herald standing on a stone slab, unfurling parchment, while peasants stood among graves listening to new taxes or military levies. Your damp corner of the yard became a courtroom and a recruiting station in one. If you were especially unlucky, you might be pressed into service simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sleep too visibly in the churchyard, and you could wake up as conscript fodder for a lord's next war. Soldiers treated cemeteries as convenient bivouacs. Campaigns left little room for comfort, and graveyards offered walls for protection, flat ground for tents, and sometimes even wells or fountains close to churches. Accounts from the Crusades mention soldiers camping in churchyards when passing through Europe, filling the space with fires, weapons, and horses tethered between stones. For you, a pauper curled up under a rag, This meant your quiet refuge could be transformed overnight into a military camp. Horses stomped the soil, men sharpened blades, and camp followers cooked meals directly over graves. By dawn, the once solemn yard looked like a battlefield waiting to happen. The presence of soldiers added its own absurdity. Armour creaked, men cursed loudly, and drunken songs echoed long into the night. Graveyards were already noisy enough with feasts and rituals, but with soldiers present they became deafening. Medieval armies were not known for cleanliness either. Latrines were dug hastily, food scraps were tossed wherever men stood, and lice thrived in every blanket. If you were unlucky enough to be among them, your already miserable night became a festival of fleas, smoke, and shouting. The irony of seeking refuge in a graveyard only to be surrounded by the very men who created more graves was not lost on anyone. And then there were the trials of war. Defeated soldiers were sometimes executed in graveyards, not only because the ground was holy, but because it was convenient. Chronicles tell of prisoners being marched into churchyards and put to death in view of the community, their bodies buried immediately in pits dug nearby. Sleep here long enough, and you would wake to the grim business of mass burials, the clang of shovels and the murmurs of priests mingling with the heavy silence of soldiers who knew their turn might come. The politics of cemeteries extended beyond armies. Disputes between lords, legal battles over land, and negotiations between factions all unfolded here. A churchyard was neutral ground, watched over by priests, but it was also public enough to guarantee witnesses. Lords argued beneath crosses, soldiers stood guard, and peasants looked on, caught between curiosity and fear. For you, lying nearby, it was impossible not to overhear. Every declaration, every shouted insult, every clink of coin exchanged for silence drifted into your ears while you tried to pretend that your thin blanket made you invisible. What made it all more absurd was the constant layering of roles. A graveyard could host a wedding one morning, a proclamation by soldiers in the afternoon, and a drunken brawl by night. The soil never rested, and neither did the people. Medieval life had no sense of division between the sacred and the practical. If you wanted to crown a king, announce a war, flog a thief, or host a feast, the cemetery was as good a stage as any. For those who used it as a bed, this meant waking up every day in the middle of history's strangest theatre. The presence of soldiers turned the graveyard into both a sanctuary and a danger. On one hand, their weapons kept away thieves. On the other, their tempers made them as dangerous as any outlaw. Sleep was shallow, nerves always tight, ears tuned for the sound of steel being unsheathed in the dark. And if you managed to drift off, the dreams that followed were hardly restful. You dreamed of marching boots, of swords flashing, of bells tolling not for prayer but for war. The medieval graveyard was a soldier's space as much as a pauper's. Oaths were sworn, taxes collected, armies assembled, and sometimes blood spilled. The stones bore witness to politics and war as much as to prayers and burials. And for the poor who lay there night after night, it meant that your bed was never simply a patch of soil. It was the very stage where life, death, and power all performed, each louder than the last. And yet, politics and war were not the only strange uses of cemeteries. Beyond soldiers and proclamations, graveyards also became stages for theatre of a different sort, where actors, jugglers, and performers entertained crowds directly over the dead. To sleep in such a place meant your midnight lullaby might be less the clang of swords and more the laughter of peasants watching a puppet show beside a skull. Not every body in the medieval graveyard was laid to rest with dignity. Some were placed there reluctantly, others shoved in hastily, and a few buried at the margins as if the very earth itself wanted nothing to do with them. For all its talk of salvation, the medieval church was obsessed with boundaries. Holy ground was valuable, and not everyone deserved equal access to it. To sleep in such a place meant you were never sure whether the mound beside you held a respected parishioner, or someone shoved into the soil as punishment. Their grave barely marked, and their reputation condemned even after death. Criminals often ended up in cemeteries, but not in the same plots as everyone else. Thieves, murderers, and those executed by the state were buried in the farthest corners, sometimes even outside the walls entirely. Their graves were shallow, unblessed, and often left unmarked. In some towns, bodies of the executed were dumped in pits with quicklime to speed decay, their remains treated like waste instead of souls. Yet there they were, still part of the same ground you used as your mattress, their restless memory part of the atmosphere you inhaled with every breath. Medieval superstition held that such spirits could not rest, doomed to wander, making the edges of cemeteries particularly frightening at night. Imagine pulling your blanket tighter, knowing that the figure shifting in the mist might not be a drunk staggering home, but the ghost of a man denied forgiveness. Suicides faced even harsher treatment. To take one's own life was considered a mortal sin, a rejection of God's plan, and the church punished it by denying proper burial. Some suicides were buried at crossroads, their bodies pinned with stakes to prevent them from wandering. Others were dragged into the least desirable corner of the cemetery, buried without prayers or ceremony. For those who slept in such corners, the soil was heavier with stigma, the silence broken by whispers of villagers warning their children to stay away. And yet, for the poor, those forgotten corners were often the only places left to stretch out on the ground at night. Your bed might literally have been the cursed soil of someone deemed unworthy of heaven, a bedmate rejected by both the living and the divine. Even those accused of witchcraft or heresy might find themselves tossed into graves without respect. The medieval obsession with purity meant that anyone tied to forbidden practices was denied the full rituals of death. Records mention women accused of witchcraft buried outside the cemetery walls, their remains considered too tainted for consecrated soil. And yet, over time, walls shifted, land expanded, and those marginal burials found themselves back inside the perimeter as graveyards grew. To the poor lying there centuries later, it meant your pillow might rest on earth that once was cursed, but was now recycled into common ground. The medieval cemetery was nothing if not practical about space. The treatment of stigmatized dead was not only spiritual but theatrical. Public executions often ended with the condemned body displayed in the churchyard before burial, a warning to anyone thinking of following the same path. Corpses were hung in chains, left to rot visibly for weeks, then dumped in shallow pits once the spectacle ended. Sleep among the stones meant your night might be haunted not only by rats and drunks, but by the sight of skeletal remains still dangling from gallows near the cemetery gate. To medieval minds, these bodies were warnings. To you, they were one more obstacle to finding rest. The absurdity of this hierarchy was that even in death, money and status brought comfort. A wealthy knight could die in a bloody tavern brawl and still be interred with candles, bells, and prime space beside the church wall. A poor farmer could live piously, give generously, and still be shoved in a corner if his family could not afford the fees. A suicide was shunned for eternity, but a lord who drowned in wine and debauchery could secure a glowing funeral if his heirs paid enough. To sleep there was to feel those inequities pressed down on you as heavily as the cold soil itself. The sensory reminders of this division were everywhere. In the middle of the yard, graves were marked with carved stones, flowers, and offerings. Toward the edges, the ground was uneven, marked only by wooden stakes or nothing at all. Rain turned the soil into mud, washing away the last traces of the forgotten. Bones surfaced more often in these corners, where burials were shallow and rushed. For you, curled in your blanket, the line between respectable and shameful dead was as clear as the difference between lying on a well-tended mound and sinking into a patch of churned, bare earth where no one had bothered to pray. Yet medieval society thrived on this division. It reinforced order, teaching villagers that sin carried consequences that lasted beyond the grave. Children were warned not to play in certain corners, lest the spirits of suicides or criminals reach for them. Priests preached sermons about the damned while standing only feet from their unmarked graves, and still, the poor slept there, choosing cursed soil over freezing fields, convinced that proximity to holy ground might still offer some shred of protection, even if their neighbours under the soil had been rejected by the church. The medieval graveyard was not equal. It was layered with privilege, stigma and punishment, as much a reflection of the living order as of the afterlife. To sleep there meant to lie in the middle of that inequality, your body sharing space with saints and sinners, each treated differently even in death. And just as criminals and suicides were marginalised in burial, so too were outsiders. Foreigners, beggars with no family, and the unbaptised were all pushed to the margins, their graves little more than holes filled quickly before anyone could complain. The soil beneath you was never just dirt. It was a record of medieval judgment carved in earth and bone. And still, beyond the divisions of the dead, the cemetery had another life altogether. For it was not only a place of punishment, commerce or stigma, it was also a stage for entertainment, where jugglers, actors and performers set up directly among the graves, turning your bed into the front row of the strangest theatre Europe had ever known. The medieval graveyard was not always grim silence, dripping candles and muttered prayers. At times it became a stage, one where entertainment, performance and absurd humour unfolded directly above the bones of the dead. Sacred ground was meant to remind the living of their mortality, but that never stopped villagers from turning the cemetery into a theatre, when space was tight and audiences needed gathering. For the poor who curled up on the stones at night, this meant your bed was not only a mattress of soil, but also the front row seat to the strangest variety show in history. Mystery plays were among the most famous performances staged in churchyards. These plays retold biblical stories, often in a style that was equal parts education and slapstick. Actors in rough costumes strutted across makeshift platforms, performing the creation, the nativity or the passion, sometimes with surprising comic flair. Devils pranced across the stage to jeers, angels descended on ropes, and peasants laughed as much as they prayed. The ground you used for sleep by night became a theatre by day, the air filled with voices declaiming holy lines, and the smell of roasted chestnuts sold to the crowd. Archaeological digs in some medieval towns have uncovered fragments of wooden platforms near old cemeteries, suggesting that these performances were frequent, practical, and profitable. Jugglers and minstrels also found the churchyard irresistible. They had guaranteed audiences after Mass, when villagers spilled into the yard before heading home. Here they played lutes, sang ballads, and juggled knives with dramatic flair, sometimes balancing on tombstones to make themselves more visible. Children shrieked with laughter, coins were tossed, and the atmosphere shifted from sacred to carnival in moments. Imagine trying to catch some rest in that environment, only to be startled awake by a lute string snapping, or a minstrel balancing on the very stone you were leaning against. For the medieval world, the churchyard was not an awkward backdrop. It was the most logical open-air stage available. The absurdity reached greater heights during festivals. On feast days like Corpus Christi or All Saints' Day, processions spilled through graveyards accompanied by music, pageantry, and actors dressed in elaborate costumes. Entire biblical dramas unfolded among the stones, complete with mock battles, demons dragged into pits, and allegorical characters representing virtues and vices. The audience roared with laughter, gasped in horror, and sometimes joined in the action. For you, a pauper lying low, the ground beneath you shook with the stamping of feet, the clashing of wooden swords, and the sound of entire villages chanting as performers mimed the triumph of good over evil. It was both theatre and sermon, a medieval blockbuster staged among the dead. Not all performances were sacred. Secular entertainers often crept into the same space, especially during fairs. Dancing bears, acrobats, and storytellers all performed in the cemetery, indifferent to the bones beneath them. Records even mention mock duels staged in churchyards, where men fought for wages while villagers bet on the outcome. To the medieval mind, death was always near, so why not gamble on life directly above a grave? The sound of laughter, applause and betting coins clashed with the solemn toll of bells, turning the graveyard into the loudest contradiction imaginable. The church tolerated this with varying degrees of patience. On one hand, performances educated the public, reinforced Christian teachings, and drew crowds. On the other, jugglers and gamblers hardly embodied piety. Complaints appear in church records about disorderly conduct in cemeteries, ranging from lewd songs to brawls sparked by drinking too much ale at performances. Yet the cycle repeated year after year. The graveyard was too useful as a gathering place to ever remain silent. Sacred ground doubled as stage, tavern, courtroom and bed, often all within the same week. For the poor who lived and slept among the stones, the aftermath of these performances was as disruptive as the shows themselves. Broken jugs, scraps of food and trampled soil were the debris left behind. Sometimes props from plays like wooden swords or scraps of painted cloth were abandoned and scattered across the yard. Waking among those fragments was a reminder that your bed doubled as a stage set, that even the stones themselves had played a role in the day's theatre. In a world where life and death intermingled daily, the cemetery was never only a place of silence. It was a carnival ground, a reminder that entertainment had no respect for the boundaries of sacredness. The sensory overload was constant. The smell of incense mixed with spilled ale, the chants of priests overlapped with the songs of minstrels, and the solemn backdrop of crosses framed the most ridiculous spectacles. Sleep was shallow in such a place, every noise dragging you half awake, every echo of applause or laughter reminding you that you were an unwilling member of the audience. Yet in its own way, it made sense. Death was the ultimate performance, and the graveyard was the ultimate stage. And still, performances were not the only form of expression to haunt cemeteries. Beyond plays, music and gambling, graveyards also became the canvas for another kind of medieval obsession. Graffiti, carvings, and strange symbols etched into stones turned them into books of stone, recording curses, prayers, and even soldierly boasts for anyone who cared to look. The cemetery was not just a theatre of voices, but a gallery of marks, each carving another whisper in the endless conversation between the living and the dead. The medieval graveyard was never a blank canvas of silent stones. Every surface was marked, scratched, or carved with the voices of the living, each leaving their trace on the walls, slabs, and wooden markers. For all the solemnity that death supposedly carried, cemeteries were cluttered with graffiti that ranged from prayers to curses to crude doodles etched in soft stone. To sleep there was to lie among messages that were never meant for you, whispers in Latin, French, or half-legible vernacular scrawled for saints, spirits, or anyone with the patience to read them. Grave markers in the Middle Ages were often simple: wooden crosses for the poor, stone slabs for the wealthy, and in between, whatever families could afford. These surfaces became canvases. Families carved epitaphs, but villagers added their own touches, scratching prayers like Ora pro nobis, or begging the saints for mercy. Sometimes the lines were clumsy, the letters uneven, clearly the work of someone illiterate trying to copy shapes they had seen. Archaeologists uncovering these stones find them layered with marks from generations, the original inscription barely visible beneath decades of additions. Imagine dozing off with your head against one of those slabs, your cheek pressed to centuries of desperate scribbles asking God for favours. But not all graffiti was pious. Some was mocking, even obscene. Soldiers passing through left crude drawings of swords, shields, or more scandalous symbols. In certain cemeteries near garrisons, slabs bear carved images of helmets or spears, soldierly boasts frozen in stone. Others left insults, cursing rival lords or mocking priests. A fragment from England bears a half-scratched line translating roughly to "better a fool in life than a liar in death." Clearly the work of someone unimpressed with the clergy. To the modern eye, it feels like vandalism. To the medieval villager, it was just another way to carve their presence into holy ground. The walls of churches themselves were not immune. Pilgrims carved names, dates, and symbols into the stone, turning churchyard walls into medieval guest books. Some etched crosses, believing it brought blessings. Others carved shoes or hands, strange symbols meant to protect travellers on their journeys. You, curled beneath such a wall, would be resting under a gallery of graffiti layered like palimpsests, the stone carrying centuries of scratches, each one a reminder that the medieval world never missed a chance to leave its mark. Curses made their way into cemeteries too. Villagers who felt wronged sometimes scratched maledictions onto stones, or scrawled them onto parchment and shoved them into cracks in the churchyard walls. Archaeological finds have uncovered lead curse tablets, folded and buried among graves, asking spirits to torment rivals or bring misfortune to neighbours. Imagine waking in the night and hearing whispers of someone performing such a ritual feet away, muttering curses as they shoved a tablet into the soil. Sleep in such a place was never peaceful. Every mound might hold not just bones, but also someone's centuries-old grudge. Symbols tied to superstition were everywhere. Pentagrams, circles, and runes scratched onto stones blur the line between Christianity and older pagan practices. Some were protection charms, meant to guard the dead from demons. Others were carved to protect the living, warding off sickness or bad harvests. Soldiers particularly leaned on such symbols. Campaigning was brutal, and a hasty carved charm on a gravestone was one more layer of imagined protection. The irony was painful. A soldier could carve a cross for safety before marching to war, then days later be buried beneath the same stone by his comrades. For you, half asleep against the slab, it meant you were propped up against someone else's spiritual insurance policy. A scribble of fear turned into permanent art. The graffiti told stories the official records never bothered with. Poor families who could not afford carved tombstones still found ways to inscribe their grief. Marks of hearts, crude faces, or initials scratched into stone surfaces are silent memorials of people otherwise erased from history. Others used humour. Jokes scratched into soft stone include playful rhymes or mocking comments, the medieval version of bathroom graffiti. To sleep among them was to drift off surrounded by centuries of voices, some desperate, some mocking, some deeply human. The sensory layer was haunting. The stones were rough, the carvings jagged under your fingers. Moonlight made the scratches deeper, shadows turning faint lines into gaping wounds across the rock. When wind passed, it felt like whispers carried from the grooves themselves, voices of long-dead villagers reaching out to anyone foolish enough to listen. For the paupers curled against them, it was not only superstition, it was tactile. You could feel the desperation, the curses, the jokes etched into every inch. And the absurdity lay in the fact that none of it ever stopped. New carvings layered on old ones, inscriptions overwritten, names erased and replaced. Stones were reused, turned sideways, or recycled as building material. Some medieval churches literally built walls with reused tombstones, inscriptions half visible on the inside mortar. The line between sacred and scrap was thin, and the graveyard carried it visibly in every marked surface. You never rested against a blank wall. It was always a palimpsest of prayers, jokes, and curses, each whispering into the night while you tried to keep your eyes closed. The medieval graveyard was a text without an author, written by everyone and no one. To sleep there was to lie in the middle of an open book, each stone carrying its own sentence, each wall a chapter of desperate humanity. And as much as those carvings tried to capture eternity, they were constantly eroded by weather, by hands, by time itself. The dead vanished, the graffiti faded, and yet the ground remained restless. For beyond the scratches and curses there were nights when the soil itself stirred, when famine forced cemeteries to become more than resting places, transforming them into pits of desperation, where humans and animals sometimes ended up sharing the same trench. For all the quiet we imagine in a medieval graveyard, the reality was often closer to a tavern with better acoustics. Far from being hushed, Solemn grounds where mourners quietly prayed, cemeteries frequently doubled as noisy marketplaces where locals sold bread, ale, and trinkets among the tombs. If you thought spending the night there meant only whispers of ghosts, you were in for the louder problem of drunken peasants haggling over onions above your head. In some towns, the churchyard was the only flat open space, so naturally it became the prime location for fairs, stalls, and even wrestling matches. The dead, in a sense, became spectators whether they liked it or not. Church authorities were well aware of the chaos, but they often tolerated it because the stalls and fairs brought in revenue. In England and France, it was common to see peddlers selling fish, cheese, and second-hand clothes right against gravestones. Some vendors went a step further, using the flat tops of tombs as makeshift tables, setting out their goods on the stone surface. Imagine falling asleep curled against a grave marker, only to wake with someone's cabbage pile rolling across your chest. This was not just possible, it was practically inevitable during feast days when markets swelled. The churchyard became a festival, and the bodies beneath served as foundation stones for commerce. The smell would have been overwhelming. Between the stench of human remains seeping from shallow burials and the piles of fresh produce rotting in the sun, you were essentially napping in a compost heap flavoured with incense. Add the fact that animals were often part of the market: goats tied to headstones, chickens flapping across graves, pigs rooting in the soil, and you had the medieval equivalent of a farmer's market crossed with a battlefield. Archaeological finds confirm bones were often churned up by rooting animals, leaving skulls and femurs exposed, which did not deter buyers one bit. Sleepers on the ground might awaken nose to nose with a rooting pig carrying a jawbone it had unearthed mid-snack. Entertainment thrived there too. Jugglers, musicians, and acrobats performed in graveyards during feast days. Picture yourself trying to drift off in the corner while a lute player belted out a tune above you, his audience laughing loudly, their feet stomping against old burials. Some medieval accounts even complain that gambling dens popped up in churchyards, with dice games played right on the tombs. A slab meant to hold a noble's eternal rest instead became the table where peasants lost their meagre coins. The absurdity of men betting half their week's wages beside freshly dug graves hardly raised eyebrows. It was simply part of the scene. Tavern culture spilled into the graveyard as well. People drank openly there, especially during religious festivals. Ale cellars set up near the church gates, serving drinks that encouraged louder arguments, louder laughter, and louder brawls. Records from bishops' courts repeatedly complain of fights breaking out in cemeteries, with men pulling knives and cudgels in the middle of holy ground. Some of these clashes ended fatally, forcing clergy to perform hurried absolutions over fresh blood stains only feet from consecrated bones. If you tried to sleep during such a brawl, the lullaby was not the gentle whisper of wind through grass, but the cracking of skulls on tombstones. The absurdity deepens when you realise that certain graveyards actually hosted full-scale fairs lasting days. Merchants travelled from afar, setting up tents among the stones. Sleeping there meant lying amid a temporary city of canvas stalls, travellers, animals, and the buzzing roar of constant trade. For soldiers passing through, graveyards could even serve as supply hubs. Medieval armies often commandeered churchyards for temporary encampments, using the open space for storing weapons or livestock. You, nestled in the shadows, might find yourself trampled beneath hooves, or pressed beneath a cartwheel as soldiers wheeled in supplies. It was not just peasants and peddlers either. Graveyards often became sites for official proclamations and punishments. Local authorities sometimes chose the churchyard as the place to read laws, announce taxes, or shame criminals. A sinner could be whipped publicly among the graves while the crowd jeered, children tossed mud, and merchants went on selling bread beside the spectacle. Sleeping nearby meant being jostled awake by a roaring crowd watching someone be punished for stealing a chicken. There was no rest to be had in such a carnival of chaos. The sensory layer is worth lingering on. Imagine the muddy ground churned by countless feet, mixing rainwater with animal dung and the soil of disturbed graves. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires, clashing with the sweet rot of decaying produce and the metallic tang of unearthed bones. Your body, already stiff from lying on hard earth, would be assaulted by fleas leaping from stray dogs wandering the stalls. The noise rose and fell in waves, laughter followed by shouting, bells ringing from the church as if desperately trying to drown out the chaos. The graveyard was supposed to be holy silence, but in practice, it was the loudest part of the town. What makes the entire scene even more absurd is how normal it all was. Villagers saw no contradiction between praying for the souls of the departed and selling onions on their graves. Religious processions passed between stalls as jugglers juggled, beggars begged, and gamblers rolled dice over the dead. The cemetery was not a separate sacred space, but the living heart of the community. To sleep there meant sinking into the middle of it all, where the boundaries between sacred, profane, and outright ridiculous blurred into one noisy spectacle. And that's where we'll leave you tonight, half asleep in a medieval graveyard, probably with a chicken roosting on your head and a gambler arguing over dice at your feet. If you made it this far, you clearly have a strong stomach for historical misery, so let me know in the comments which video you want to see next. And if you actually enjoy drifting off to the sound of human suffering through the ages, go check out my other videos. There's plenty more sleepless nights of history waiting for you.